2.3 million. That's what the HOA president listed my grandfather's private lake for on Zillow, just 6 days after his funeral. I drove out there and found surveyors staking the shoreline, a backhoe already digging near the old dock. She was standing there with a clipboard, grinning. His funeral flowers were still wilting in my truck.
We're developing this unused waterfront,
she said without looking up.
The board voted. It's for the community's benefit.
Unused. That's what she called the lake my grandfather owned since 1964. The one he maintained himself, where we all learned to swim. I showed her the deed. She smirked.
Sweetie, the HOA covenants override that old paper now.
What would you have done? Drop your state below. How many of you have dealt with an HOA like this? Stick around. The sheriff's visit changed everything. My name's Declan Morrison, and 2 weeks before this whole nightmare started, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. Messy divorce took my house in Portland, my savings, even my dog. The only thing left was my grandfather's cabin, 40 acres of peace I hadn't visited since I was 12. Earl Morrison raised me during summers after my dad bailed when I was 8. Taught me to fish on that 12-acre lake, carved my initials next to his in the memorial oak by the dock. When cancer got him last month, he left me the one place I'd ever felt like I belonged. The smell of his pipe tobacco still clung to the cabin corners when I moved in, mixing with that distinctive lake moisture and old cedar. Everything exactly like I remembered. Rough-hewn porch rails worn smooth by decades of hands, loons calling across water so still it looked like black glass. Even the well water tasted the same, what Grandpa called purest in 3 counties. He'd owned this place since 1964, bought it from a failing lumber company for practically nothing. Built the A-frame himself, hand-stocked the lake with bass every spring, maintained every trail and dockboard with religious dedication. 40 years of sweat equity in a place that never asked for anything but respect. The property meant everything to our family. This was where Mom brought me after the divorce papers were signed, where I learned to drive stick in Grandpa's old pickup on the logging roads, where he taught me that sometimes the best therapy comes from fixing things with your own hands. I'd been there exactly 2 weeks, still sleeping in his old bed surrounded by the musty scent of wool blankets, when Vivian Blackwood rolled up in her white Escalade. See, Millfield Estates, that's the McMansion development next door, got built 5 years ago. Vivian's the HOA president, former real estate agent who understands property values. Married to city councilman Bradley Blackwood, drives around with HOA official vanity plates like she's some kind of law enforcement. The woman had been circling like a vulture since Grandpa's illness. I found out later she'd already drawn up development plans, figured the grieving grandson would sell cheap and run back to the city. She'd been asking around town about the inheritance situation while I was literally picking out his casket. She was wrong about that. Day after our little parking lot confrontation, she came back with backup. Clipboard full of official documents, fake EPA complaints, forged county ordinances, staged photos of what she called mosquito breeding hazards. This standing water situation violates 3 different health codes, she announced, not even bothering with pleasantries. The crunch of gravel under her designer flats sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard. We're prepared to help facilitate a reasonable solution. I laughed. Actually laughed. Lady, this lake was here when your development was still a twinkle in some developer's eye. Her smile never wavered, but I caught that little muscle twitch near her left eye. Mr. Morrison, I understand you're grieving, but community safety takes precedence over sentimental attachment. That's when 3 of her neighbors showed up. Concerned residents who just happened to drive over together, all wearing the same fake sympathetic expression. They offered to help negotiate a fair sale because they were worried about property values. Funny thing about vultures, they always travel in flocks. I remembered something Grandpa used to say while we sat on that dock at sunset. When folks start measuring what ain't theirs, they're planning to steal it. He kept meticulous records in a fireproof safe somewhere in the cabin, but I hadn't found it yet. Original survey, deed, correspondence with the county. The old man documented everything like he was expecting this exact fight. Which was good, because Vivian's next move was filing a formal complaint claiming my septic system was contaminating community groundwater. Apparently I needed a $15,000 inspection and remediation. Immediately. The texture of her fake concern felt like sandpaper against my nerves. But I was an electrician, not a lawyer. I knew circuits and current, not property law. What I didn't know yet was that my grandfather had been 3 steps ahead of people like Vivian his entire life. 3 days later, some guy in a county truck showed up at 7 a.m. with a clipboard and an attitude. "Rex Dillingham, environmental compliance," he announced, flashing an official-looking badge. "Got a report about contaminated groundwater. Need to do an emergency assessment." I was still in my boxers, coffee mug in hand, watching this stranger march around my property like he owned it. The morning air carried that crisp September bite, mixed with the diesel fumes from his truck idling in my driveway. Something about his whole setup felt off. The truck looked too clean, his uniform too new. Rex took hundreds of photos. My septic tank, the dock, even the inside of my cabin. Spoke in official jargon about environmental impact assessments and public health hazards. Everything sounded legit until he handed me a bill for $3,500. "Emergency assessment fee," he said. "Due immediately, or we red tag the property as uninhabitable." Now, I may have been going through a rough patch, but I wasn't born yesterday. My divorce lawyer had taught me to question every document that demanded immediate payment. "Since when does the county charge for inspections?" "New federal requirements," Rex replied without missing a beat. "EPA mandate." The metallic taste of suspicion filled my mouth. Real government inspectors don't usually show up demanding cash on the spot. That evening, Vivian organized her little dog and pony show at the community center. Concerned neighbors meeting with a slideshow about health risks from my property. She'd turned my grandfather's peaceful lake into some kind of environmental disaster zone, complete with stock photos of algae blooms and dead fish that clearly weren't from around here. The stale coffee taste lingered in my mouth as I watched 20 people nod along to her lies. She had charts, graphs, even testimonials from worried parents about children getting sick near the water. Professional presentation for such amateur fraud. But here's where karma kicked in. Rex got careless while packing up his equipment, dropped his business card right at my feet. Dillingham Environmental Consulting, private contractor, not county employee. I called the real county health department the next morning. Sweet old lady named Dolores answered the phone, and her voice had that genuine government employee tone, tired but helpful. "Emergency septic inspection? Hun, we don't have anyone named Rex on staff. And we sure don't charge $3,500 for assessments. You might want to call the sheriff about that one." Turns out no official complaints had been filed, no emergency orders issued. Rex was about as official as a $3 bill. Grandpa always said you could spot a con man by how fast he wanted your money. Real authorities have patience because they have real power. I started documenting everything like I was building an electrical schematic. Photos of Rex's fake credentials, recordings of Vivian's meetings, copies of all the fraudulent paperwork. Built a timeline showing the coordination between her complaints and his convenient arrival. Frank at the hardware store mentioned something that made my blood run cold when I went in for trail cameras. That HOA lady was asking about lake drainage equipment 3 weeks ago. Seemed real interested in pump sizes and flow rates. 3 weeks ago. Grandpa was still alive 3 weeks ago. The smell of fresh electronics and motor oil filled Frank's store as I picked out the best cameras I could afford. She mentioned why she needed that information. Said something about future water management projects, Frank replied. Didn't think much of it at the time. I installed those cameras around the property perimeter that same night, hidden among the pine branches like Grandpa taught me during our hunting trips. 2 days later, they caught something beautiful. Rex returning under cover of darkness, planting contamination evidence near my shoreline. The night vision footage showed him scattering plastic bottles of green dye, dumping dead fish from grocery store bags, even spreading some kind of algae powder in the shallows. The crunch of footsteps on dead leaves gave him away on the audio. Amateur hour. Miranda Steele, attorney at law, had an office above Frank's hardware store. I brought her everything: the fake inspection, Rex's business card, photos of evidence tampering, and the security footage. "This is textbook harassment," she said, spreading the documents across her desk. The late afternoon sun streaming through her window made the forgeries look even more obvious. Tortious interference with property rights, criminal fraud, evidence tampering. We can get a restraining order against this Rex character and probably press charges. Filed the police report that same day. Amazing how fast things move when you have actual evidence instead of just complaints. Rex got served with a restraining order before the week was out, and suddenly his environmental consulting business became very hard to reach. But Vivian wasn't done. Her husband Bradley mentioned at the next city council meeting that bigger authorities might need to get involved soon. Environmental Protection Agency, state regulators, maybe even federal oversight. The woman was escalating because her first plan failed. That should have been my warning that things were about to get much worse. 2 weeks later, a real government vehicle pulled into my driveway. This time it was the actual Environmental Protection Agency, complete with official logos and a very confused inspector named Janet Walsh. We received a detailed complaint about unauthorized industrial water extraction affecting the regional water table, she said, checking her tablet against my address. The morning fog was just lifting off the lake, and I could smell the diesel exhaust from her official EPA truck mixing with the crisp autumn air. Janet seemed genuinely puzzled as she walked the shoreline. The complaint described large-scale commercial operations, pumping stations, contaminated runoff, even unauthorized dam construction. But this just looks like a normal private lake. That's when I realized Vivian had fed the EPA a completely fabricated story. The complaint described industrial-scale water theft, ecosystem destruction, and commercial fishing operations, none of which existed anywhere on my 40 acres. "Ma'am, this lake's been here since 1964, I explained. My grandfather stocked it with bass, maintained it himself. It's spring-fed, completely natural." While Janet conducted her real inspection, Vivian's harassment campaign had gone nuclear. Fake cease and desist orders arrived daily, noise violations for my generator running at night, wildlife interference for feeding the ducks, even an unauthorized lighthouse operation because of Grandpa's solar dock light that had been there for 15 years. My insurance company called with news that made my stomach drop. "Mr. Morrison, we're canceling your homeowner's policy. We've received multiple anonymous complaints about your property being an uninsured high-risk water feature with inadequate safety measures." The taste of panic was metallic in my mouth. No insurance meant no mortgage protection, no liability coverage. If someone got hurt on my property, I'd lose everything. Vivian was systematically destroying my ability to keep the land. But here's where her overconfidence became her downfall. Janet's EPA inspection revealed something that changed everything. "Mr. Morrison, I need to show you something disturbing," Janet said, pulling up files on her tablet. "Whoever filed this complaint provided detailed aerial photographs of your property, professional drone surveillance taken without permission." She showed me high-resolution images of my cabin interior, taken through bedroom windows, photos of me sleeping, eating, even showering with the bathroom window open. The level of privacy violation was sickening. "These photos were clearly taken illegally," Janet continued, "and using fabricated evidence to trigger federal investigations is a felony. We're referring this to the FBI for criminal prosecution." The taste of victory was sweet, but I knew Vivian wasn't finished yet. That night, I was fixing a broken motion sensor when I heard voices from the woods beyond my property line. My trail cameras had night vision, but sometimes you need to get eyes on to understand the full picture. I found Rex and 2 other men in the stream that fed my lake, 50 yards inside my property boundary. They had expensive testing equipment and were actively contaminating water samples with some kind of green chemical. "Make sure these readings show heavy pollution," Rex was instructing the others. "She's paying us 10 grand to prove this lake is poisoning the entire watershed." I got 15 minutes of video and audio on my phone, clear evidence of them manufacturing fake contamination while trespassing on my land. The next morning brought an unexpected ally. Jasper Quint, a retired forest ranger who'd worked with Grandpa for decades, showed up with a box of documents and a grim expression. "Earl always said you were smart like him," Jasper said, settling onto the porch with that distinctive creak of old wood under weight. "He also told me if anyone ever tried stealing this land, I should help his family fight back." Jasper had kept copies of everything: original surveys, state correspondence, documentation proving the lake's private status since 1964. But more importantly, he knew Vivian's history. "She pulled this exact scheme in Bend 3 years ago," he explained. "Harassed a retired couple with fake environmental complaints until they sold their lakefront cabin for 30 cents on the dollar. She flipped it to resort developers for $2 million. The chill of recognition ran down my spine. This wasn't personal vendetta, it was a business model. "Only reason she stopped in Bend was because the family had a nephew who worked for the state attorney general," Jasper continued. "Once real authorities got involved, she disappeared overnight." We filed federal fraud charges that afternoon. criminal trespassing, evidence tampering, conspiracy to commit environmental fraud. The FBI was very interested in someone using fabricated EPA complaints to steal private property. 3 HOA board members showed up at my door that evening, faces flushed with embarrassment and anger. "We had no idea," the treasurer said. "Vivian told us you were refusing to pay legitimate assessments. We never authorized surveillance or fake inspections." They'd discovered she'd spent over $40,000 in HOA funds on her harassment campaign without board approval. Financial fraud on top of everything else. The smell of wood smoke from my fireplace mixed with the approaching storm clouds. Change was definitely coming, and for the first time since this started, I felt like I was winning. 1 week after the FBI got involved, Vivian made her most desperate move yet. Federal Fish and Wildlife agents showed up at dawn with scientific equipment, prepared to drain my entire lake based on what they called credible reports of invasive species threatening the regional ecosystem. Agent Sarah Brighton looked genuinely concerned as she explained the situation. We received detailed documentation about zebra mussels, Asian carp, and toxic algae blooms that could spread to the Columbia River system. If true, this requires immediate emergency drainage. The crisp morning air carried the diesel smell from their pump trucks as I watched them prepare to destroy everything Grandpa had built. Vivian stood at the property line with a clipboard and her fake concerned expression, probably calculating how much money she'd make once the lake was gone. "These are the invasive species photos," Agent Brighton said, showing me images on her tablet. "Very concerning if accurate." I looked at the pictures and almost laughed. They were stock photos from the internet. Obviously fake zebra mussels photoshopped onto what wasn't even my lake. The Asian carp photo still had a watermark from some fishing website, and the background showed palm trees. "Ma'am, these aren't even from my property," I said. "Look, we don't have palm trees in Oregon." Agent Brighton's expression shifted from concern to anger as she examined the evidence more closely. "Someone provided falsified documentation to trigger a federal environmental emergency. We need to find out who filed this report." The investigation was suspended immediately, but Vivian wasn't finished. While the agents packed up their equipment, she was already on her phone with what sounded like her next scheme. "Photos didn't work. Need the backup plan. Commercial development angle." That afternoon, Jasper arrived with his own revelation that changed everything. "Your grandfather was more than just a conservationist," he said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. The musty smell of old paper mixed with brewing coffee. "This lake was state-certified wildlife preserve from 1967 to 1982. Earl won conservation awards for bass habitat management." The documentation was incredible. Correspondence with state biologists, university researchers, even thank you letters from Oregon Fish and Wildlife. But the real bombshell was in a letter dated 1985. "Says here your grandfather had some kind of special arrangement with the state about property boundaries," Jasper noted. "Something about retained rights and perpetual easements. Might want to look into that." Agent Brighton was fascinated when we showed her the real conservation records. This lake is actually a model ecosystem. Whoever filed those false reports was trying to destroy a documented conservation success. But instead of backing down, Vivian doubled down. That night, my trail cameras caught her directing a crew with portable pumps, attempting to drain the lake under cover of darkness. "Emergency community safety measure," she was telling the workers. "HOA board authorized immediate action." The sound of high-powered pumps echoed across the water until something went wrong. Jasper later winked and mentioned he'd made some educational adjustments to their equipment using Forest Service maintenance skills. By dawn, 3 pumps were burned out and Vivian was screaming at contractors about equipment failure. My cameras captured her entire meltdown, including her admission that she was handling this personally because the board doesn't understand the urgency. But here's where things got interesting. Agent Brighton returned that morning not with arrests, but with questions. Ms. Blackwood claimed full authority to act on behalf of the community, she told me. Said she had documentation proving the lake posed immediate danger. We need to verify her legal standing before proceeding. 3 HOA board members arrived within the hour and they were furious. Vivian has no authority to authorize lake drainage, the treasurer said. We never voted on any emergency measures. She's been acting completely on her own. They'd also discovered financial irregularities, special assessments for environmental compliance that never went to environmental work, money that seemed to disappear into consulting fees and private contractor payments. "We're calling for her immediate removal and a full forensic audit," the secretary announced. But removal proceedings take time, and desperate people don't wait for bureaucracy. That evening, Vivian made a phone call that my trail cameras picked up clearly. She was standing by my property line, speaking to someone about commercial development opportunities and $50 million lake resort potential. Oh, property owner is just one man, no family, no support. Can be handled. The threat in her voice was unmistakable. She was escalating beyond harassment into something much more dangerous. Jasper and I sat on the dock that night watching the stars reflect in the water while discussing our next moves. "Your grandfather always said this land had secrets," Jasper mentioned casually. "Something about emergency papers he kept hidden. Said if anyone ever tried stealing this place, those papers would settle things permanent like." The loons called across the water as I wondered what else Grandpa had planned for situations like this. The next morning I was cleaning out Grandpa's workshop in the basement when I noticed something that didn't make sense. His workbench was built against what should have been the foundation wall, but when I moved it to vacuum behind it, my knuckles knocked against hollow wood instead of solid concrete. The wall was fake. Behind a sheet of painted plywood, perfectly camouflaged, I found a steel safe built right into the foundation. The musty basement air carried a metallic scent mixed with decades of motor oil and wood shavings. The combination was hidden in the most obvious place possible, carved into the weathered bottom of his favorite fishing tackle box, the same one where he'd taught me to tie my first fly. The safe opened with a satisfying mechanical click, and what I found inside made my coffee-stained fingers tremble. The deed I'd been showing everyone was just the surface deed. The real documentation showed that Grandpa had purchased far more land than anyone knew, including me. According to the original 1964 survey, complete with hand-drawn boundary markers, my property extended 400 feet beyond the current fence line. 15 houses and Millfield estates sat on my land, but the revelation got even better. Grandpa hadn't sold his land to developers in 1987. He'd sold surface development rights only, while explicitly retaining subsoil rights, mineral rights, water rights, and perpetual access easements through the entire development. The paperwork was bulletproof, recorded with the county clerk, title insurance protecting every claim, even original surveyor's brass pins with GPS coordinates. Everything a property lawyer dreams about seeing. I called Miranda immediately, the taste of anticipation sharp on my tongue. "This is extraordinary," she said, after reviewing the documents for 40 minutes, her professional composure intact but her voice tight with excitement. "Declan, you don't just own your lake. You legally own the ground under half of Vivian's entire development." The legal structure was elegant in its simplicity. Every house built on my land was technically on leased ground, leases that had expired in 2010 without renewal. For 13 years, those homeowners had been living on my property without legal permission, through no fault of their own, but legally trespassing nonetheless. "What are my options?" I asked. "Technically, you could demand immediate vacation or charge retroactive rent. Realistically, most of these families are innocent victims who bought homes believing they owned the land underneath." Here's what made Grandpa's strategy brilliant. The deed included perpetual access easements through HOA territory. I had legal right to use their roads, their infrastructure, even charge them for crossing my retained mineral rights. Grandpa's hidden letter, written in his careful electrician's handwriting, explained everything. "Declan, if you're reading this, someone's trying to steal our family legacy. I saw this coming when they started building those houses in '87. The sale was strategic chess, not desperate selling. I kept every right that matters while letting them think they bought everything. The lake, the underground, the access, it stays Morrison family property forever. Use this power to protect what we built, but remember, most folks are just trying to live their lives. Don't punish families for developers' deception." The sweet taste of justice filled my mouth. Instead of defending against Vivian's harassment campaign, I now held enough legal leverage to end her schemes permanently. I could calculate retroactive ground rent, roughly $800,000 for 13 years of unauthorized occupation, or offer reasonable long-term leases that secured everyone's homes while protecting my inheritance. But first, Vivian needed to understand exactly what she'd been trying to steal. I secured copies with Miranda, photographed every document, locked originals back in Grandpa's safe. The basement workshop still smelled like his pipe tobacco and decades of honest work. Vivian thought she was stealing a simple lake property. What she'd actually done was harass the legal owner of the ground her entire community depended on. Time to teach her that some lessons come with permanent consequences. That evening, I called a war council at the cabin. Miranda arrived with legal documents, Jasper brought his surveying equipment, and 3 sympathetic HOA board members showed up looking like they'd discovered their church treasurer was embezzling the Christmas fund. "We need maximum impact with minimum collateral damage," Miranda said, spreading papers across my kitchen table. The lamplight cast long shadows over property maps while the rich smell of Grandpa's old coffee percolator filled the air, the same one that had fueled his early morning fishing expeditions. Helen Kozlov, the retired teacher who'd taken over as interim HOA treasurer, looked genuinely sick as she revealed Vivian's financial crimes. "She's embezzled over $75,000 in special assessments. Money residents thought was going to road maintenance and community improvements went straight into her consulting fees. The plan we developed felt like something Grandpa would have appreciated. Patient, thorough, and absolutely devastating. Let Vivian continue digging her own grave while we prepared the ultimate revelation at the annual Millfield Community Festival. She always gives her big State of the Community speech there," Helen explained. "This year she's planning to announce her successful resolution of the lake situation. Instead, she'd be announcing her own arrest. Jasper taught me to use Grandpa's original 1964 surveying equipment, brass transit level, steel measuring chains, even the original wooden surveyor stakes. The metallic smell of old brass mixed with the oil he'd used to maintain the equipment for 60 years. Period-correct instruments add legal authenticity," Jasper explained, adjusting the telescope. "Courts love seeing continuity of measurement standards across decades. Now, here's something most people don't know about property disputes. Original survey markers are like DNA evidence. They're nearly impossible to fake and carry enormous legal weight. Every brass pin Grandpa installed in 1964 was still buried under Millfield Estates' landscaping, waiting to be revealed. We spent 3 days with metal detectors, following Grandpa's hand-drawn maps to locate every corner pin. The satisfying electronic beeps echoed through the autumn air as we found marker after marker, some buried 4 feet deep under decades of construction debris. "Your grandfather was a genius," Jasper said, photographing GPS coordinates. "He knew developers would try claiming this land eventually, so he made the evidence bulletproof." Rebecca, Helen's daughter who worked for the county newspaper, had been investigating Vivian's background. What she found explained everything. "She's pulled this exact con in 4 states, targets recent widowers with waterfront property, manufactures crises until they sell cheap, flips to developers for huge profits." But she'd never met someone with Earl Morrison's foresight. The physical evidence was overwhelming. 15 Millfield Estates homes sat clearly on my property, some with swimming pools extending 50 feet past their supposed boundaries. Professional surveyor Claude Hartwell was amazed by the documentation quality. "This inheritance includes some of the cleanest property rights I've ever seen," he said, reviewing the preserved records. "Your grandfather created an unbreakable legal foundation." We coordinated with federal agents building their own case. Agent Brighton confirmed they'd found Vivian's fake EPA reports in 4 states, all targeting private landowners near valuable development sites. She's running a sophisticated property theft operation using environmental fraud as cover. The festival timing was perfect poetic justice. Vivian always used her annual speech to justify special assessments and announce community improvements. This year, she planned to celebrate acquiring the lake for resort development. Instead, she'd face federal arrest warrants and the revelation that she'd been trying to steal property from someone who legally owned half her development. The evening before the festival, we conducted our final strategy session. Every piece of evidence organized, every legal document prepared, every federal agent briefed on timing. 20 years minimum for environmental fraud, Miranda said with professional satisfaction. Add embezzlement, conspiracy, and racketeering, she's looking at life. But prison wasn't enough punishment for someone who'd tried stealing my family's legacy while traumatizing innocent neighbors with elaborate lies. The public revelation needed to be absolutely devastating, complete exposure in front of everyone she'd deceived. I sat on Grandpa's dock that final evening, watching stars reflect in the water he'd protected for 60 years. The smell of wood smoke from my chimney mixed with the crisp autumn air that promised winter was coming. Tomorrow would end Vivian's schemes permanently and restore honest relationships in our community. Jasper joined me with 2 beers and that satisfied grin of a man who'd helped right a serious wrong. Earl would have loved watching this plan come together. He always said patience is the deadliest weapon against thieves. The loons called across the water as we toasted tomorrow's justice. Somewhere in Millfield Estates, Vivian was probably rehearsing her victory speech, completely unaware that she was about to become the main attraction at her own public downfall. The week before the festival, Vivian made her most audacious move yet. A convoy of black SUVs pulled into Millfield Estates, and men in expensive suits started walking my property line with clipboards and cameras. Commercial developers, the real deal. I watched from my kitchen window as Vivian led them around like she was giving a royal tour. The morning fog clung to the lake surface while these strangers pointed at my dock, my cabin, even Grandpa's memorial oak tree, like they were mentally bulldozing everything. $50 million, I heard her say as they walked past my trail cameras. Full resort development with championship golf course. The lake becomes the centerpiece water hazard. She'd signed preliminary agreements representing herself as the authorized community representative for lake development rights. According to Rebecca's investigation, she'd already collected a $25,000 good faith deposit from Cascade Resort Development. The metallic taste of rage filled my mouth. She was literally selling my inheritance to out-of-state corporations while I watched. But here's where her greed became her downfall. Cascade's due diligence team started asking uncomfortable questions about property ownership and development rights. Ms. Blackwood, their lead attorney said during a recorded phone conversation my cameras picked up, our title search shows some discrepancies. Can you provide documentation proving the community's legal authority over the lake property? Vivian's response was pure desperation. The current occupant is problematic, but that situation will be resolved through proper legal channels very soon. She was planning something final, something that would eliminate me as an obstacle permanently. That night, she held an emergency HOA meeting without notifying the actual board members, just her allies, about 8 people who either owed her money or believed her environmental propaganda. The lake situation requires immediate action, she announced to her hand-picked audience. We've exhausted legal options. Sometimes community safety demands more direct intervention. The implications were chilling. She wasn't talking about paperwork anymore. The next morning brought a visit that confirmed my worst fears. Rex showed up with 2 men I didn't recognize, claiming they were conducting a final environmental assessment before lake drainage. But they weren't carrying testing equipment. They had surveying gear, construction tools, and what looked like demolition supplies. Property's been condemned by federal authorities, Rex announced with that fake official tone. Immediate vacation required for public safety. I called Agent Brighton immediately. There's no federal condemnation order for your property, she confirmed. Someone's impersonating federal officials again. We're sending a team. While waiting for backup, I documented everything through my trail cameras. Rex and his crew weren't testing anything. They were planting more fake evidence and preparing to physically destroy my property. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed with the crisp autumn air as they unloaded equipment clearly designed for demolition, not environmental assessment. Whatever Vivian's final plan was, it involved making sure there was nothing left for me to inherit. Agent Brighton arrived with FBI backup just as Rex was setting up what looked like explosives near my dock. Federal agents, step away from the equipment. The arrest was beautiful to watch. Rex tried claiming he had authorized demolition permits until agents found his trunk full of fake federal documents, forged EPA orders, and enough fraudulent identification to run cons in 12 states. But Vivian wasn't finished. That afternoon, she called another emergency HOA meeting, this time with the entire community invited. Her message was simple. Either the residents supported community action to resolve the lake crisis, or their property values would crash when resort development was canceled. Sometimes good people have to take matters into their own hands, she told the crowd. The desperation in her voice was obvious to everyone except her most devoted followers. Helen confronted her directly. Vivian, you don't have board authorization for any of this. You're operating completely outside HOA authority. The board lacks vision, Vivian snapped back. I'm protecting this community's future while you people worry about paperwork. Several residents walked out in disgust. Others demanded her immediate resignation, but a core group of about 12 people seemed ready to support whatever direct action she was planning. That evening, my trail cameras caught Vivian meeting with this inner circle in the community park. Their conversation was recorded clearly. The festival is our last chance, she told them. If we can't resolve this peacefully, we'll have to consider other options. The resort deal dies without lake access, and everyone's investment becomes worthless. One of her supporters asked the obvious question. What other options? Vivian's smile was cold enough to freeze lake water. Sometimes accidents happen to difficult people, especially when they live alone in remote areas. The threat was clear, recorded, and absolutely criminal. I sent copies to Agent Brighton, local police, and Miranda immediately. Tomorrow's festival wasn't just going to expose Vivian's fraud. It was going to stop a woman who'd escalated from theft to conspiracy to commit violence. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves as I sat on Grandpa's dock that night, knowing it might be my last peaceful evening before everything exploded. The day before the festival, Vivian's desperation reached its peak. I woke up to find professional-grade surveillance equipment installed in trees around my property, cameras, microphones, even motion sensors pointing at every window and door. She was monitoring my every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The morning air carried an unusual chemical smell that made my eyes water. Jasper arrived early with his metal detector and immediately noticed something wrong. "Someone's been poisoning the lake," he said, showing me dead fish floating near the shoreline. "This isn't natural die-off. Someone dumped industrial chemicals upstream." My trail cameras had captured it all. At 3 a.m., Vivian and two men had dumped barrels of what looked like pesticide into the stream that fed my lake. They were creating an actual environmental disaster to justify their fake emergency measures. "She's going scorched earth," I told Miranda over the phone. "If she can't have the property, she's going to destroy it." But Vivian's chemical attack backfired spectacularly. The smell was so strong it wafted into Millfield Estates, causing residents to call the county health department about toxic fumes from the lake area. Real environmental investigators arrived within hours, and they were not pleased to discover deliberate chemical dumping in a protected watershed. "This is criminal environmental destruction," the lead investigator told me. "Whoever did this is looking at federal terrorism charges." Meanwhile, Vivian was making her final preparations for the festival. She'd hired additional security, 3 men with the kind of muscles that come from prison weight rooms, rather than legitimate gym memberships. The festival setup began that afternoon, and Vivian was everywhere, directing workers with manic energy. She'd ordered the largest stage in the event's history, complete with professional sound system and video screens for her historic announcement. Rebecca overheard her practicing the speech. "Today marks the dawn of a new era for Millfield. The lake property has been successfully acquired for community development, and groundbreaking for Cascade Resort begins Monday." She was planning to announce her fake victory before anyone could stop her. That evening, I received a visit that chilled my blood. 2 of Vivian's hired security approached my cabin after dark, their footsteps crunching on gravel like breaking bones. "Ms. Blackwood wants to discuss a final settlement," the larger one said. His voice carried the kind of casual menace that suggested violence was just another business tool. "She's prepared to offer you $50,000 cash to sign over lake rights and relocate immediately. Tonight." The metallic taste of adrenaline flooded my mouth. "And if I refuse?" His smile revealed gold teeth and absolutely no warmth. "Let's just say accidents happen to stubborn people, especially ones who live alone." I recorded the entire conversation on my phone while my trail cameras captured their faces. Direct threats of violence in exchange for property rights, textbook extortion with federal implications. After they left, I called Agent Brighton immediately. "We need that festival to happen," she said. "Let Vivian make her announcement. We'll be ready." The FBI had been building a RICO case against Vivian's entire operation: environmental fraud, property theft, extortion, conspiracy, even interstate commerce violations. The festival would be her final performance before federal arrest. That night I couldn't sleep. The smell of chemical contamination drifted through my windows while security lights from Vivian's surveillance equipment cast eerie shadows across Grandpa's peaceful property. She'd turned our quiet community into a war zone, all because she couldn't accept that some things weren't for sale. Jasper stayed over as backup, armed with his old service rifle and decades of experience dealing with dangerous wildlife. "Human predators aren't much different from the 4-legged kind," he said. "They always overplay their hand when cornered." At midnight, my motion sensors detected movement near the dock. Vivian herself was there with a gasoline can, apparently planning to burn down Grandpa's memorial oak tree as a final act of spite. The tree where his ashes were scattered. The tree where he'd carved my initials 60 years ago. I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside. "Get away from that tree!" She spun around, her face twisted with rage in the harsh light. "This ends tomorrow, Declan, one way or another. You're right, I said, thinking about all the evidence we'd gathered, all the federal agents positioned for tomorrow's arrest. It does end tomorrow. She poured gasoline around the tree's base anyway, then lit a match. Too late to stop me now, she snarled. But Jasper had quietly positioned himself with a garden hose, and the flames died before they could catch. Vivian screamed in frustration and stormed off into the darkness. Tomorrow's festival was going to be unforgettable for everyone involved. The chemical smell mixed with residual gasoline fumes as I sat guard over Grandpa's tree until dawn, knowing that in 12 hours, justice would finally arrive. Festival morning dawned crisp and clear, with 300 residents gathering in Millfields Community Park for what they thought would be a celebration of successful lake development. They had no idea they were about to witness the most spectacular public downfall in HOA history. Vivian took the stage at exactly 2 p.m., wearing a white power suit that made her look like a dictator addressing her subjects. Behind her, massive video screens displayed architectural renderings of Cascade Resort and Community Lake Club with membership fees and luxury amenities. Today marks a historic victory for our community, she began, her voice amplified across the park. After months of negotiation, I'm proud to announce that the private lake situation has been resolved through proper legal channels. The crowd of residents, media representatives, and unsuspecting families listened as she painted herself as a visionary leader who'd secured their financial future. The lake will become our community centerpiece, professionally managed for everyone's benefit. Property values will increase by an estimated 40%, and Cascade Resort will bring jobs and prosperity to our region. She was so confident, so completely convinced of her victory, that she never noticed the FBI agents positioning themselves around the park perimeter. I stood at the back of the crowd with Miranda, Jasper, and Surveyor Claude, waiting for the perfect moment. Agent Brighton had given us the signal. Let Vivian finish her fake triumph speech, then deliver the devastating truth. I've personally negotiated a fair compensation package for the previous property occupant, Vivian continued. He's agreed to relocate, and groundbreaking begins Monday morning. That was my cue. I walked calmly to the front of the stage and politely asked for the microphone. The crowd murmured in confusion. Most didn't recognize me, but a few elderly residents who'd known Grandpa started whispering among themselves. Thank you, Vivian, for gathering everyone together, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the park. Since you've mentioned legal documents and property rights, I'd like to share some that actually matter. I nodded to Claude, who unfurled a certified surveyor's map showing the true 1964 property boundaries. The display was visible to everyone, 15 Millfield Estates homes clearly marked as sitting on private land. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Declan Morrison, Earl Morrison's grandson. This is the original survey from 1964 when my grandfather purchased this property from the lumber company. The crowd's murmur shifted to shocked silence as they realized the implications. Vivian is absolutely correct about legal documents, I continued. So let me read from the deed that actually controls this land. Miranda stepped forward with the authenticated property records. These documents show that Mr. Morrison's grandfather never sold his land to developers. He sold surface development rights only, while retaining mineral rights, water rights, and subsoil ownership. The visual impact was devastating. Surveyor Claude pointed to houses on the map while explaining how property boundaries work. 15 families realized they'd been living on land they didn't actually own. Every home in the marked area sits on private property, I announced. For 13 years, through no fault of your own, you've been living on Morrison family land. Vivian tried grabbing the microphone. This is fraud. Those documents are fake. That's when Agent Brighton stepped onto the stage with her federal credentials. Ms. Vivian Blackwood, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit environmental fraud, embezzlement of community funds, extortion, and filing false federal reports. The crowd erupted as FBI agents moved in. Vivian screamed about outside agitators and property theft, but her words were drowned out by the sound of handcuffs. Rebecca began photographing everything for the county newspaper while local TV crews captured Vivian's meltdown for the evening news. The fake lake development deal involved a $25,000 fraud against Cascade Resort, Agent Brighton announced. Ms. Blackwood collected deposits for property she never owned or controlled. But I wasn't finished. As Vivian was led away in federal custody, I took the microphone for my final statement. I want everyone to know I'm offering 99-year ground leases to affected families at fair market rates. Unlike some people, I believe in actual community cooperation. The relief on 15 families' faces was immediate and genuine. They wouldn't lose their homes because of Vivian's fraud. This property will remain protected as my grandfather intended. The lake stays clean, the trees stay standing, and anyone who wants to fish or swim is welcome, just like it's been for 60 years. The applause started slowly, then built to a roar that echoed across the water. Federal agents, local residents, even the media representatives were clapping for justice served and community restored. Vivian's screams from the federal vehicle provided the perfect soundtrack as 3 years of harassment, fraud, and environmental crime finally met their consequences. The smell of autumn leaves mixed with the sweet taste of absolute victory as I watched her dreams of stolen millions disappear behind FBI badge numbers and handcuffs. 6 months later, Vivian Blackwood was serving a 15-year federal sentence for environmental fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. The FBI's investigation revealed she'd attempted similar schemes in 7 states, stealing over $3 million from communities and property owners. Her husband Bradley resigned from city council in disgrace after investigators found he'd helped falsify municipal documents. Rex and his crew of fake inspectors received their own federal sentences, and the entire environmental fraud network was dismantled. But the real victory wasn't revenge. It was what grew from the ashes of her schemes. The 15 affected families negotiated fair ground leases that protected their investments while respecting my inherited rights. Monthly payments of $50 per household seemed reasonable to everyone, and the 99-year terms meant their children would have security too. More importantly, the community had learned valuable lessons about HOA accountability and property rights. New board elections brought in Helen Kozlov as president, with transparent financial reporting and strict limits on presidential authority. Never again, Helen said during her inaugural speech, will one person have unchecked power over our community's future. I used the lease income to establish the Earl Morrison Conservation Trust, fulfilling Grandpa's vision of protecting the lake and surrounding habitat. The water quality recovered completely within 3 months once we removed Vivian's chemical contamination. The lake became an outdoor classroom for local schools where kids learned about fish habitat management and water conservation. Grandpa's original research station was restored and donated to the community college's environmental science program. Miranda and I grew closer through shared values and respect for the land. She moved into the cabin permanently last month, bringing her law practice to our small town and helping other families fight property fraud. Your grandfather would be proud, she said one evening as we sat on his dock, watching the sunset paint the water gold. You protected his legacy and built something better. The annual community festival was relocated permanently to the lakefront with my blessing. What had started as the site of Vivian's downfall became a celebration of genuine cooperation and environmental stewardship. Local tourism increased as word spread about our conservation success story. Families came to fish in Grandpa's carefully maintained waters, hike the trails he'd cleared, and learn about sustainable lake management. The cabin itself was renovated but respectfully preserved. I kept his pipe tobacco smell in the workshop, his hand-carved railings on the porch, even his coffee percolator that still brewed the best morning coffee in 3 counties. Jasper became our unofficial conservation educator, teaching visitors about surveying techniques and property boundaries. His favorite saying, Earl Morrison showed us how to play chess, while others played checkers. The smell of wood smoke from our fireplace still mixed with lake moisture and pine scent on quiet evenings. The loons still called across water so clear you could see bass swimming 30 feet down. But now children's laughter echoed from the shoreline during school visits. Families picnicked under Grandpa's memorial oak tree. The community had become what he'd always envisioned, a place where people respected the land and each other. Federal agents occasionally visited to update us on related cases. Vivian's fraud network had victimized dozens of families across the western states, and our evidence helped convict the entire organization. Your documentation made this case airtight, Agent Brighton said during her final visit. Other victims got their property back because of what you preserved. The justice felt complete, but the real satisfaction came from fulfilling Grandpa's vision. His careful planning had protected not just our family legacy, but an entire community from predators who saw only dollar signs where others saw home. Every evening, I read his hidden letter again, especially the final paragraph. Build something better than what they tried to destroy. The land will outlast all of us. but the choices we make echo through generations. The Conservation Trust would protect this place forever. The lake would stay clean, the trees would keep growing, and future generations would learn about stewardship and community responsibility.